Welcome everyone to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, and we have got a great guest today, Tom Tilley. Tom Tilley has just written a book called Speaking in Tongues. Some of you may know Tom. I knew Tom from Triple J. Tom, Hack, that you used to host, was my daily current affair and news program that I'd travel on the train home from work listening to. You are going to tell us a lot more about your upbringing as a teenage fundamentalist. But one fact that I didn't know about you, actually, Tom, that you were the bass player in Client Liaison. And I love Client Liaison. And I didn't know that until I read your book. But your book, Speaking in Tongues, is something that, particularly for Troy, resonated an incredible amount, because it was, for our listeners, you would know revival centres is Troy's bread and butter. And Troy, tell us about how it must have resonated with you.
Yeah, well, until the book came along, I didn't know who Tom Tilley was, to be honest, and I've never heard of Client Liaison until I read the book. But then again, I was overseas for a good 12 years, Tom, when all that was going down. So forgive me. I left Australia listening to Triple J and came back listening to some semblance of Gold or Smooth FM kind of thing. So that gives you an idea how old I am.
You grew up.
I did indeed, and it was quite depressing to come back and hear Green Day on Gold FM, which was a bit of a worry.
Yeah, when songs from your childhood are on classic hits, you're well and truly over the hill, don't you? But Triple J, I don't know, the music, it's targeted a very young demo. I was listening to Gold in my early 20s.
Wow. I still listen to Triple J, Tom, and maybe I'm just trying to hang on to my youth.
And in all fairness to you, you were in a religious cult at that age, which probably diminished your ability to pick good music.
Well, yes. There's about 400 songs in the Revival Centre songbook. I actually recently went through them when I was writing my book because I wanted to get some lyrics in there, and we couldn't get clearance for the song I wanted, which was I'll Fly Away, which is a gospel classic, which we also used to sing in the Revival Centres. So I actually had to change it out of the prologue and put in Amazing Grace. We sung that a lot as well, but I put that in there because we could get the rights. It had passed copyright.
The irony shouldn't be lost on us that you were singing about grace in one of the most graceless environments that you could imagine.
True. Look, it's great to be here, guys, on this podcast. This is, I feel like I'm stepping into a community that I didn't know about, but I obviously have a right to full membership of, broadly speaking, this ex-evangelical movement. And I've known nothing about it because I haven't really ever been public about my story of growing up in the revival centres. And I moved away from it and got on with my life outside of all Christian circles, especially the revival centres. And so since I've written the book, I'm being flooded with people saying, you are telling my story. This is exactly how I grew up. And it's so good to know I'm not alone, or people who know they're not alone because they're already part of this broader ex-evangelical kind of community who seem to be out there supporting each other through what can be a complex journey after you leave.
Yeah, well, welcome home, brother. Welcome home.
It's a weird feeling.
When I was reading your book and you were telling the story about Maruya, because Maruya was actually the camp where I got, in air quotes, saved. And the one thing that I could almost hear, like I could smell the must and the dust and the wood of the whole place. But one thing that I could almost hear was, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. That was a big revival centre one, because Brian, our symbol was a horse and rider, right, which was this herald. And so this song was all about horse and rider. So it was sort of the unofficial revival centre song, especially for us in Youngies, which was what we called youth group.
And you could sing it in rounds as well. So you could sing the first verse over the second verse. And I can hear it being sung in that Maria Hall. When you just sang it there, I imagine, because that room was a wooden floor, tin shed basically, and there'd be stomping of feet and clapping of hands, not in the full-blown charismatic style like you've experienced in some of the churches you guys have been to, but as far as the sort of buttoned up 1950s style of the Revival Centre goes, that was a banger.
That's right. Syncopated clap too. Cha, cha, pa. Yep, that was the one.
Love to come to a party with you fuckers. Wouldn't that be a great night? We'd be
You.
syncopated clapping and singing in rounds. Wow.
But dude, before you get too judgmental, the AOG wasn't too far off that. I mean, especially the one we're in, quite a classically Pentecostal scene.
Yeah, look, allow me to judge just for a moment. But you're right. It's I do remember standing on a stool song leading People Enjoy as a Flag Flown High. So I
Oh, there you
can
go.
yeah, yeah. These things happen. There
Oh,
was
God.
it's sad. And I think as we chat today, Tom, that we are going to definitely bump into lots of similarities. We were having a chat before we press record, and you were quite surprised by the similarities in our journeys, even though we've been in quite different spaces, just about the types of people that we came across and the ones that tried to control our lives. So we're looking forward to having a chat about those things.
Yeah, those archetypal characters seem to exist in so many settings, probably outside religion as well as inside religion, which I sort of touch on towards the end of my book. But, you know, one of the unique things about a church that believes it has the only right path to salvation, like the revival centers does, and a path that's different to pretty much everyone else, is that you're cut off from the rest of the Christian community. And so we grew up not knowing what the rest of the Pentecostal movement was like. All we knew is what we were told, which was that they had basically missed the point and diluted the salvation message, and that they were jumping and singing and falling over, and that they weren't going to heaven. That's literally about all we knew.
Yeah, that's right. And it was indulgence. They were just indulgence. That's what they were doing. It's just indulgence. But,
Yep.
Tom, thinking about this podcast, right? So I think this is hopefully going to be a very different kind of interview to the others that you've done, because we're not going to ask you, what was it like to speak in tongues, or, tell us about interpretation. We don't give a shit about that. We know all about that. So hopefully this is going to be a very different interview. But I want to ask you, why did you write the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I'll tell you how it initially came about. I think it was something that had floated around in my head for many years, which, along the lines of there's a big story to tell there, and if I ever was to tell it, a book would be the right place, because you can give it its proper context and give it proper depth. And I'm in this business. I'm a radio maker and TV, etc. So I'm sort of working across all the mediums, and I'm like, that's not a documentary. Could be a film, but it's definitely, that's something that could be a book. And if I ever wrote a book, that would probably be it. And as I sort of got a bit of momentum at Hack, publisher came to me and said, "Oh, love to get you to write some books. We'll sign you up on a 3-book deal, blah, blah, blah. You can write about all the youth issues that you've covered on Triple J." I was like, maybe, but I do have this other story I've been thinking about, which is I grew up in a hardline Pentecostal church. I could write about that. And they said, "Oh, that's what we want. That's the book we want." So that was like where the idea came. But to actually decide to put this out in public was, I guess, a bit of a deeper transition for me, because as a teenager, I was embarrassed about being in the revival center. I loved it. I loved my friends. I loved the community, and I loved that we were looking to a bigger purpose than just, footy, booze, and whatever else everyone else did all over, on their weekends. But really, to my school friends, I was embarrassed by it. And then once I'd left in my 20s, I wanted to move on, and I wanted to fit in then as well. And so it wasn't my lead story when I met someone at a party once I'd left. So and then I got into my career, and again, I was a journalist wanting to be impartial. So I wasn't like bringing lots of my backstory into my work. But eventually I got to the point where I was really happy with where my life had landed, really satisfied with what I'd been able to achieve, the friends I'd made, the relationships that I was able to rebuild with my family after their own journeys with the church. And I just thought, you know what, if my life's come to a great place and this is part of the story, then why be embarrassed about it? It's made me stronger. It's part of what's made me who I am. It's helped with my ability to think critically, challenge authority, ask questions. It's also helped probably give me this thirst for community and connection, which is a big part of who I am as well. So I felt finally that this was a challenging, tough story, but there was so much good in it that it was worth sharing.
It's interesting, Tom. Like, we connected and resonated with so much of your story in your book, and definitely one bit that I resonated with, similar to you. Like, I wasn't brought up in Pentecostal circles, but came into it when I was a teenager. But similar to you, I was so embarrassed by it outside of it.
Mm.
I loved it while I was in there, and I think part of that for me was deep down, I was thinking, I think this is a crock of shit. I'm really not quite sure how much I buy into this, but I love it. But I'm embarrassed by it because I'm not sure how I can sell this to people. Whereas Troy was opposite. Troy was an evangelist. Troy was, witness at every opportunity, and we're incredibly different. And we've been mates since back then. But he freaked me out because he would talk to anyone about it, and he was incredibly convinced. But also what you spoke about the positives, and we really try to highlight that in the podcast, is
Mm.
there's some really good things that came out of it. There's also some good things that we carry forward, and some of that is definitely about community. It's about connection. It's the ability to be able to connect and talk with anyone because you
Yeah,
had to. It was an odd bunch, wasn't it?
that's right. And a lot of people came to that church or any church because they have deep, pressing, sometimes super urgent needs, and so it attracted people from all walks of life. And yeah, I think, normally you'd be friends with your parents' friends in society and the people you meet at school or in your suburb. But yeah, in these churches, and I think also in those regional settings as well, also means you have to really cross the different sections of society. So I think that makes you a better person. Like my son, I've just had a baby 8 months or 9 months ago. He's going to grow up very differently. He's not going to have some of that stuff. He's not going to meet as many weirdos. He might, but I'll probably have to engineer it, or it's going to be very different. So yeah, I agree with you.
So, I mean, when you wrote this book, was it for you? Was it a little bit of an owning it, owning what you'd been part of, owning, and almost a coming out of your story of going, I'm going to own this. This was my past. This actually shaped me, and it was a really important part. But who did you hope would read and connect with your story?
Yeah, it was about owning it. It was about saying this is the full picture of who I am, because it's weird, I've been on national radio and national TV. A lot of people sort of know me. A lot of people don't, like Troy.
I know you now. I know you now.
You know me very well now. 350 pages worth of backstory. Yeah, it was. It was about giving the full picture, and I've come to the firmly held belief that your weaknesses and your challenges are that's the beauty of a person. That's where you have to kick into gear and grit your teeth, and that's when you learn and grow. So, and humans sit around and tell stories for a reason. It's because we learn from each other. Like, that's how we pass on culture. And so I think, why did you write the book? It's like, I think it's just a basic urge a lot of humans have, not everyone, but I'm an extrovert. We have a desire to share because we get something out of that. That's how we pass on our culture, I think, and our learnings.
Tom, I think it's interesting that you captured the essence of a time of what it was like to be in the revival centers. And I was thinking a subtitle for your book, could be Speaking in Tongues, and then the subtitle could be Guilt and Sex, because that's what it was. That was the essence of revival centers: speaking in tongues, guilt, and sex, and certainly community and all that kind of stuff as well. And I think some of our listeners are going to be listening to this and thinking on some level that they relate because they were in Pentecostal churches and they can see some of it. But it wasn't like other Pentecostal churches, was it? And so tell us about the Revival Center attitude to other Pentecostal churches.
Yeah, it was basically they'd misinterpreted the Bible. They'd somehow missed this glaringly obvious meaning that we took from Acts 2 and then overlaid over the rest of the New Testament, even though when you actually unpack it, there was no verse that said you have to speak in tongues to have the Holy Spirit or be saved. And actually, they just linked a few moments together and decided that was the blueprint, that what happened on that, the day of Pentecost was the blueprint for salvation. What happened on other occasions, like in the house of Cornelius, was following exactly the same blueprint, and we all should. And then assume that when Paul was talking about tongues to the Corinthians, that he was talking about it in exactly the same way that the revival centers used to talk about it. there were all these recontextualizations and joining of dots that should never have been joined to land on this theory. So we were the ones who had it right and everyone else was wrong. And so from the most traditional Catholic or Anglican churches right through to the Pentecostals that were probably very similar to us, like the CRC, as I understand it, is very similar to the Revival Centers, just doesn't believe that you have to speak in tongues to be saved, has a similar view on that to other Pentecostals, the baptism of the Spirit almost being like an extra enriching
The
element
second
to your
stage, they call it.
Yeah, the second stage, which ultimately goes on to sort of enrich your prayer life. But so for that whole spectrum, we just wrote them off. We had nothing to do with them. Speaking to anyone else in the Pentecostal movement would have been just as bad as, I don't know, having a close association with anyone. And, so everyone from the Pentecostals, just like us, mainstream Christians, right through to just straight up heathens, as we would have called them, they were all in the same basket as far as we were concerned. They were wrong and they were not going to heaven like we were. As far as I can tell, so I went to a few other Pentecostals on my journey after the Revival Center, and there were some similarities, but I didn't get a sense that they were anywhere near as hard line. Like, as far as I could tell, they weren't permanently excommunicating people for fornication or throwing people out of the church for going to the wedding of an ex-member, that kind of stuff.
So why do you think the Revival Centers are so aggressive towards other Pentecostals then?
So I see the mistake the Revival Centers have made with their doctrine. I see that as a cancer that has all these symptoms. That's what I see as being at the core of almost all of their problems. So if you have a doctrine that's completely different to every other group, then you have to maintain an identity that's different to all those other groups. So from there, that's where the laws start to build in around it. The legalistic framework starts to build about when and how you can and can't talk to people who may have left the fold, what constitutes being inside versus outside. So if you're the only group that has the path to salvation, it requires these delineations that lead to all these ridiculous rules. And I think one sort of leads to the other. You guys would understand very well this kind of fundamentalist creep where you define one thing, and then if there's any doubt around it, well, if there's a doubt, then the answer is no. So the sort of field of control just grows and grows and grows as you try and find certainty or definition where there really isn't any, because many things in life are a spectrum rather than a binary.
I wonder if it didn't happen in reverse. More that they became separate, became exclusive. We are, sort of like a pride. We are the truth. And then from there, they started to, need to define themselves. Why are we better than everybody else? And then from there, that doctrine sort of came out. Because from my understanding, they didn't start that way. They started the same as every other Pentecostal church and then shifted later on.
Yeah, so I've wondered the same question, but I haven't done the research to find the answer. Like I've read Hearts of Fire by Barry Chant, and I've spoken to him and spoken to a few other people from the Pentecostal movement, but not in a huge amount of depth. It was more just to get a general understanding of where the Revival Center fit and where and when it was formed. But I also am still left with the question, when exactly did Lloyd Longfield, the founder, decide on that distinct speaking in tongues doctrine? Was that the reason he initially split off from the CRC and formed the Melbourne and Geelong Revival Centres? Or, I think as you're alluding to, he broke off for a different reason and then somewhere over the next few years or few decades developed a stronger position on speaking in tongues, and that was more of a gradual thing, and then everything built, in reverse, as you say. I mean, what's your understanding?
Tom, you have come to the right place. Let me tell you, my friend, because we have Troy here who did his master's on revival centers. He's also he's quite published in the space. He's got the internet is full of Troy's research into revival centers. So, Troy,
I thought your name looked familiar.
Yeah. Well, I didn't actually do my master's in the revival centers. I did a graduate diploma capstone And then I decided I don't want to do this. I want to do something else. So yeah, I didn't do my masters in the Revival Centre, but yeah, they broke away from what was then the Commonwealth Revival Crusade in '58 and didn't come out with that doctrine until '59. So that doctrine was mulling around, much like the as I like to call it, the fornication doctrine was knocking around until they nailed their colours to the mast, so to speak. So yeah, that's why that was a bit of a loaded question to you. Do you think maybe it was the opposite? Because it was.
Yeah, but I mean that's just 1 year, right? So obviously there was potentially that kind of thinking, much like the fornication position potentially, where that was in his head, maybe subconsciously, and then it took a year for the sort of formal policy to form around it, or what's your thinking?
Yeah, quite possibly. But I mean, Lloyd Longfield was power grabbing from the start. There was split after split, right up until they actually broke away. There was a number of splits in the whole, in their time in the CRC and all that kind of thing as well. But you know what? I don't want to bore our audience with talk about ins and out of the details of the Revival Centre. So let me ask you this question, Tom, because you talked about in your book, right? Obviously, tongues was a big deal, as was sex and guilt. But you talk about your uncertainty around this speaking in tongues experience. I mean, if that's a defining point in the Revival Centre, this is what makes you this. And this, look, I know you unpack this in the book. Elaborate. This is what makes us what we are, and I don't think it's true.
Yeah. So when you said the subline of the book could be guilt and sex, I almost jumped in and said the subline to my book, I think, is speaking in tongues, a journey of doubt. And ultimately, I think you could say my book's about many things. Like you could also say it's really about family, which it very much is. But doubt was a huge theme from my point of view, and I have lived with that. I lived with that doubt. So yeah, thought I received at 10 in the same musty Scouts cabins that you'd remember so well from Maria. Come back, go to my first prayer meeting, thinking, right, now I speak in tongues. This prayer meeting is going to be great. Previously I've been sitting there watching the clock. Oh, a whole hour? My goodness. And yeah, get to that first prayer meeting, think I'm going to be just connected to God the whole time and it's going to be epic. And my brother's tongue, which was so unconvincing, starts annoying me. I'm like, ugh, he's faking it. And then I thought, am I faking it? Maybe I'm faking it. Maybe they're all faking it. No, surely they're not. The adult sounds really convincing. It's me. Mine was a fake. How do I walk it back from here? I can't publicly denounce my speaking in tongues experience. So I just tried to keep praying and just sort of buried those doubts, but they never, ever went away. But I never talked about them.
It's funny. Look, tongues is such a bizarre thing. We've got a whole episode on it. Listen to it, Tom. I think that you'll really connect and relate to it. But I remember, when I became a Christian and my conversion story was, my brothers had become Christians before me, and I said to them, basically not in these words, but what defines you and blah blah blah, and they spoke about tongues. I said, "Oh, hit me with it. Speak in tongues." So they did, and I remember at the time thinking, "Wow, this is really bizarre." So I sought after that. I received that. I spoke in tongues for many, many years, probably 15 years all up my Christian journey, and I never questioned it. I thought this is legit. Like, this
Wow.
is another direct prayer line to God. And I look back on it now and go, you fuckwit. Like, how can you actually think that that was real? How do you look back on tongues when you think about it now?
Well, now that it's all come out in the wash, I realize I was right. It was nonsense. And I'm giving a talk in Perth in a few weeks, and the theme that they've asked me to talk on is truth and honesty. And I think back and I thought, if I'd been honest about what I was thinking back then, I could have blown the whole thing up 15 years earlier, saved my whole family a lot of trouble, But as you guys have discussed in episode 36 and 37, and probably quite a few more, that's not something that's easy to do, is to blow up your world, which is so easy when they're so legalistic and dogmatic. So yeah, looking back, I was like, I was right to doubt that because it wasn't real for me. I still I still give people the freedom to believe that it's real for them, and it looks like it is for some people. And I want to give people that bit of grace in a way to have their own faith and their own experience. But for me, it wasn't real. For my brothers, it wasn't real. My dad still, I think, connects with it, but doesn't see it as literally necessarily. It's almost more of a meditative sort of practice in a way, almost, or connection with that part of his inner life. Yeah, so I could have called it out a lot earlier, but there was too much writing on it, because it wasn't just me. If I'd sort of voiced my doubts early, I wasn't just sort of putting myself right out on the edge, but I was essentially questioning the whole thing, because it was central to the organization's identity.
One of the things that stood out to me when I was reading your book was when you went to your dad about, "Oh, is this speaking in tongues?" Whatever. Your brother was you were
Yeah.
whatever. Your dad said your tongue could evolve over
Mm,
time, and when I read that, right, I was like, and back in the day, it's like, oh, you grow into your tongue. That's one of the things the
mm,
revival centers used to say to us, and the
mm.
AOG probably says similar things. But your tongue could evolve over time. That's just like, looking at it now, it's just so foolish. I mean, basically what they're saying is that they coach you to speak in tongues, and then when it's not quite good enough, they go, "I just keep practicing." I thought it was supposed to be a miracle. I thought it was supposed to be this holy language, and yet even for them, they're saying, "Oh yeah, it'll grow, maybe."
It's a straight up contradiction, isn't it? That it's a gift from God, but you can improve it over time. It's like, no, that doesn't stack up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's like the miracles. When people get healed bit by bit, basically, the same amount of time as it takes to get over something naturally. That's what they do, whereas the Bible is people get healed. It's a miracle.
Yeah, well, that I was a little bit happy with that line in my book, saying where the miracles range from resuscitations to getting the best park at the supermarket, which wasn't that hard in a country town of Mudgee, like 7,000 people. Oh, the other day I pulled up at the Woolies, and you wouldn't believe it, right out the front
Jesus gave
door.
me a park, yeah. That's right, 40,000 children starved to death today, but Jesus gave me a car park.
I mean, my car park had a picture of a wheelchair on it, but it was free.
That's how you knew it was yours.
I mean, what's it like for you guys? I mean, you're a lot deeper in this. To see someone like me and Brian, you knew what I did and who I was. What was it like to see me come out with this book?
To be quite honest, I was quite flawed. I was like, I didn't think, obviously you hang out with the cool kids at Triple J. Triple J's very left, progressive, all those things that revival centers weren't. So when this came out, I went, "What? Tom Tilley was a teenage fundamentalist?" And but because I mean, it's so opposite to how you come across. And for me, it was surprising yet not surprising in the way that you certainly shied away from who you were because you were embarrassed by it. And I'm sure that there's millions of other stories out there that are similar of people who now don't believe in the foolishness of what they believed, but have at that time you obviously they hide that, but now they come out and here they are, and you go, God, you were too. So yeah, it floored me, to be quite honest, but in the
Mm.
same way there's so many others which I think are similar.
I'm of the opinion that Lee Sales came from a Pentecostal background as well. So there's another one of your ABC. I don't know if it's true. It's been said on our and apparently the ex-prime minister too. Did you know about that one, Brian?
Yeah, no,
Apparently
oh,
he was.
ScoMo, no, it's all rumor. He's never been to Hillsong.
Yeah, apparently doesn't speak in tongues, so not a real Christian.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's what I thought. He thought he's not a real Pentecostal. Hey, can I throw another name at you?
Yeah,
Because you name this person in the book,
yeah.
and that is Ian McGregor.
Mm.
Now, let's get the lawyers out, right? Let's just be careful and all that we need to do. But he was the same guy that kicked me out of the Revival
Really?
Centre. Yeah, man. You and I, Maruya and Ian
Yeah.
McGregor, right? We can bookend each other's lives, I'm telling you. Now, he was a really nice guy in the 80s, I've got to say.
Mm.
Back in the early 80s when I first was, involved with him, he was a very nice guy. Treated his own two kids youngest kids like absolute shit. They ended up being booted as well. But he evolved into this, I don't know, this hitman, this Revival Centre dude that, did the worst. And
Yeah.
we ended up going to church with his nephew, didn't we,
I
Brian?
was best man at his nephew's wedding.
In the AOG. So, yeah, man, like it's funny. You think that you're not connected to the whole Penty scene.
Mm.
You totally are, brother. Totally.
I know. And that's, when I read Hearts of Fire by Barry Chant and read the history of the Pentecostal movement in Australia, it was a mind-blowing read for me to understand the full context of where our church fit into this bigger story, that the movement had been spurred on by what had happened in Los Angeles and kicked off at the Temperance Hall, and then the CRC had got going, or and around the World War II, a young man, Lloyd Longfield, had joined and then broke off in 1958. And then I could see that I was part of something bigger, because I just never saw it that way. It wasn't, as we discussed earlier, not the way we were taught to think about it. So that was kind of nice, to be honest. I just had this deeper sense of understanding of what I'd actually been a part of.
Did you ever have a look into? I mean, you've read Barry Chant's book, but did you ever have a look into some of the other ex-member stuff that was all over the internet? And I point to Troy, who was involved in that a fair bit, but there was a fair amount of stuff out there.
Yeah. So I've chatted to a guy called Ian who did the Amaru, I think it's called, that blog.
The
So
AMU blog.
Amu, yeah. So I saw a lot of the stuff that was getting posted there, which some of my favorite stuff was some of the original documents that he had. And so, yeah, I saw a lot of what people were saying there, different threads, different conversation, ex-members. Around the time when I was leaving in 2002, I also went through a lot of blogs, and a lot was being written. What was the main site for the Critical Revival Voice at the time? Can you remember, Troy?
Yeah, it would have been AMU was
It would
the
have been that
dominant
one,
one.
was it?
Yeah.
Even back that far.
Oh yeah, back into the 90s.
Right, yeah. So yeah, I checked out some of that stuff at the time, and it was like reading a conspiracy theory. I was like, oh my God, it's all wrong. And that actually was a little bit part of my awakening as well. I'd almost forgotten about some of that, actually. And then yeah, bit of the more recent stuff. But I feel like, next to you, Troy, who's obviously done a lot of work in this space, I really, as you would have seen, kept this book very personal. And for me, it's just the way I wanted to do it. I wasn't trying to paint the broader picture so much as really, really chart that internal psychological journey that I went on. So I read probably, I don't know, a dozen different books broadly around speaking in tongues in different parts, but it was really just to fill out a bit of my background knowledge so that I understood where my story sat, broadly speaking, and then sort of stuck to my own narrative. So I've read a bit of stuff, but not a huge amount.
The other big thing for revivalists obviously is sex, and that was another big part of your book too. So let's talk about sex. Tell us how you think that whole experience, like, and you're really, really quite, and I don't mean graphic in a negative way. I mean you really bare your soul with your whole sort of sexual struggles and everything. But let's talk about that. How did this whole experience of being in the revival center craft you or mold you sexually?
Mm. Well, initially I bought into this notion of going into a marriage without, the beauty of going into a marriage without having been physically intimate with someone else. I liked that idea. Right into my middle teenage years, I was on board with that vision, and I had crushes on girls at school, and some pen pal relationships with girls in the church, but I wasn't really tested that hard. My urges weren't that strong, and as I said, I liked the vision. And then the temptations came much closer to when I was ready to leave the church. So, my first church girlfriend, we didn't even really come close to breaking the rules, partly because she was even more careful than I was. Yeah, then I met this girl from Europe around the time where it really started to unfold, and she was a very liberal European woman. Hadn't had any of this sort of rules or any of the holding back like I'd had. So then I got really tested. But the funny thing was, for me, I left over the next 6 to 12 months. I left the church after meeting that person, and we ended up in a 3-year relationship. but it took me another 2 years from leaving the church to finally have sex. 2 years. And that was because I felt that because the revival center policy was permanent excommunication, that felt like a final cutting off from kind of ever going back to my family. It was all, if you think about it logically, it doesn't make sense. But these were just feelings of connection, and it was like fornicating was drawing up the drawbridge from the connection to my family.
It was never going back. That's the other thing. You're in a church that said this is the line. When I was reading your book, when I was seeing the stories that you were telling about this, she was Dutch, was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I could just sense her just going, "Oh, for fuck's sake, come on, hurry up!"
Fuck.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You could just sense that. But at the same time, when you did finally do it, right? Was it a monumental event? Could you almost hear the dun 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 of the music, and or was it just natural and it just kind of happened? How did you cross that line?
I mean, the funny thing about the way I do things, and I sort of got an even clearer picture of this through my book, like, in some ways, the stuff that's happened and where my life ended up going looks kind of radical, especially, given where I came from. But I'm just a really careful person, all those little micro steps were super careful. So by the time I actually got to having sex, I'd built up the confidence to know that it wasn't going to somehow rattle me. So in a way, it was all the time and the build up and the internal transition up to that point that made me really comfortable with it when I did it. So in that sense, in terms of like the guilt theme, that wasn't a huge issue by that point. In terms of the experience, yeah, it was pretty special, and that relationship was kind of on the rocks by then. But I felt like, given, as you said, she was there for that journey, this was the person I wanted to share that moment with. And so it still was a big deal, but it didn't rattle me. That's only because of the kind of lead up work, which is a weird way to say it. Yeah. The psychological preparation I did on myself in a way, it's a bit strange, but yeah.
Yeah, look, it was a massive part of your story in your book, and I think you said before that you couldn't be physically intimate with someone else, but you couldn't be physically intimate with yourself. You couldn't masturbate either. I mean, that was frowned upon. Anything sexual was frowned upon, wasn't it?
Yeah, they weren't as hardcore about that though. Everyone masturbated. And it didn't feel like you needed to confess that to the pastor. But if you touched someone's private parts or fornicated, then there was enough guilt to make you feel like you needed to fess up.
Yeah, whacking off was more an AOG sin, I think, Brian, than a revival center sin. Like you can't have it all, mate.
Well, it was. Look, in the AOG, it was definitely frowned upon, and it was a constant confession many times a day. But it was, definitely sexually unhealthy. Sorry, Troy.
No, I was just going to say, do you remember we've had this conversation before that it was because Jesus said if you think about it, or if you've done it in your heart, it's the same as doing it. So I used to think about the cricket while whacking off, right? And it wasn't a homoerotic thing. It wasn't like I was thinking of dudes. I was just thinking about anything, because I'm not a big sports person, right? I hated sports, so I used to just whack off thinking about the cricket, because that was the furthest thing I could possibly get from, I don't know, where were we, the 90s, Claudia Schiffer in a bikini or whatever it was going to be.
I feel like this is like a Jerry Springer episode.
I know you gave me a hard time last time I mentioned that I was thinking about the cricket.
I did, because I mean, cricket. How can you stay hard thinking about cricket? Anyway, that's just my.
Well, you just hurry up and get it over and done with. But see, that leads me to my next question for you, Tom. Do you think you're still sexually messed up by all this shit that happened?
No. I basically, yeah. It's sort of like it just delayed it, I think. I think in some ways it was relatively normal. Like if that, I think the average age of someone having sex is more like 16 or something like that. So if that experience from when I was 23 had happened 7 years earlier, and then I'd gone on from there, and it took, let's say, it was another 7 months before I had sex with someone else, and then it was a few more months after that it was maybe the third person. So that's probably pretty normal if it starts a bit earlier, say 5 or 10 years earlier. It just meant it looked a bit strange when I was having my wildest times in my early and mid 30s rather than my kind of late 20s. So I ended up very liberal around all that stuff. I sort of hint at some of it in the book, but maybe it maybe made me a bit wilder than I would have been otherwise, because it had been sort of kept away or made to sound in some way shameful when clearly it shouldn't have been.
I think a lot of people who walk away from high control groups tend to act out sexually because we were wound so tight for so long. It's like you let go and it sort of springs, at least for a while. It's like a slinky sort of opening up for a while, and then it finds a natural resting state, which is, what happens. Because a lot of ex-penties and a lot of, other kinds of fundamentalists, they're out there living really wild, hard lives, but not for too long because, well, I shouldn't say not for too long, but not forever, because eventually you start to find your morality, you start to find what matters to you and, your sense of right and wrong. But it's hard because I think when you walk away from a group like that, you doubt everything that they told you about right and wrong, and you kind of have to find what is true. So there's a period for me in between the revival centers and the AOG, and even after the AOG, where I did a lot of shit that I wasn't really proud of, but it's not who I am now.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, for me, it wasn't like I got out and went wild. It sort of just built very slowly. So it was, left at 21, lost my virginity at 23, slowly started to, be, hitting up house parties and making friends around Sydney through my 20s, and it sort of got looser around 30. So that's why I'm a little bit unsure how much of mine is a reaction to the church, because I don't know would your expectation of that typical reaction for it to be happen much sooner after the exit?
Yeah, I think so. And I had a lot of my friends that left that did that. I mean, what about the AOG, Brian? Do you think that's true? A lot of people sort of leave and react quite quickly, and they'll stick it in anything.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that was it, and even like if I can compare my circumstances, that I got married relatively young in the AOG, got
Yeah.
divorced in my 30s, and then I had a very similar reaction. I went out and went a bit wild for a few years before settling back down. But
You got those rashes, and you had to get the creams and everything. It was pretty full on.
That'll slow you up.
Yeah, so just for our listeners, none of what Troy said is true. There were no rashes. But yeah, look, I think it does happen, but I don't think there's a one size fits all response. I mean, your response
Yeah.
is your response, and you were saying to us, Tom, before we started recording, that you're quite a measured person, and I think in your public persona, that would be something that people definitely do pick up about you. You like, as a journalist, you're not someone that you're not Lee Sales from 7:30 Report, who is going in and really trying to hold people to account on things. Real hardcore journalism. You're very measured in the response, and you saw that in some of your shows like Hack Live, where you did offer voice to many people there. So maybe it's part of your personality that you're a bit more balanced and measured than Troy and I, who are extreme.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, there were moments where I grilled politicians, but I was very careful not to show left or right wing bias. That's what I mean by measured in the journalistic sense. I still went after people, but I always tried to keep it very centrist so that all the taxpayers felt like they were getting their money's worth. But in terms of sex, yeah, and this is like, it's a good question. Was it all a reaction to the church, or how did it affect me? That's what I've struggled to really. I actually don't know. I don't know how much of it was a reaction to the church, partly because it took many, many, many years to sort of go to the far end of the liberal spectrum. And yeah, I don't know. In the book, I write about like the partying and stuff, that it wasn't really a rebellion. Actually, it was more of a search for community and connection, because that's what I loved about being at all these warehouse parties, house parties, raves, concerts, gigs, festivals, touring with the band. I just loved meeting awesome people from different walks of life. And it was like, do you remember those beautiful moments as a kid in the church where you'd go to house meetings and you'd be out in the backyard running around with all the other kids? And it was this swirl of just kids running around, playing, saying whatever came into your head, feeling completely free in that safe space with all your friends. That's what I felt like, being off chops at 2 a.m. with hundreds of people that you knew from around town. That was the closest thing I could get to it.
Revival centres with ease.
Yeah.
Sounds great. I mean,
No
you've
comment.
talked. No, none needed. You're an ABC journalist, Tom. For God's sake, everyone knows how left you are. You've been dropping these left, right, and centre. You talked about in your book, some of your epiphany moments, I guess. And you'd been brought up, you'd been taught all your life, revival centre good, everyone else bad. But you talk, it's somewhere around the middle of your book. You say that you suddenly came to that realization that you don't need to be in the revival centers to be a good person. Can you tell us about when that dropped and you thought, and that really hit home?
Yeah, well, isn't that funny that was an epiphany? Like, isn't that just so obvious? And so within that statement, there's so many layers and so much coding in that statement, or there was if you were brought up in the revival centers. And yeah, that's where I met this crazy Scottish guy when I was backpacking in Barcelona, and we'd had a bunch of nights out, and we were sitting there having a coffee. And as you guys read in the book, he started telling me about his version of Christianity, and he would, Tom, Jesus would be out in the streets sitting in the gutter with the prostitutes, not telling people they're not good enough because they've fornicated. He was sort of betraying the more compassionate side of Jesus, out there with the sick and the weak and the people in society that needed love and compassion, not this sort of dogmatic, rule focused overlord, which is sort of how he was portrayed in our church. And I was also high on the joy of traveling for the first time, and I thought, wow, I'd like to be out there helping people. Like, I don't want to go back and be part of this negative, boring church. Like, I'd rather express my faith in good works by doing charity work. And I sort of had these visions of traveling through Africa and supporting local communities, or, deep in the jungle in South America. And he sort of helped me, he sort of steered me towards this adventurous, exciting, compassionate version of Jesus Christ. And I thought, well, if you followed his example and lived that kind of life, how could you not be going to heaven? Like, how could that lead you to hell? And I hadn't pieced together the doctrinal underpinnings of those concepts at that stage. I did later, but it just showed me that there was another way to be righteous and good, and it didn't have to go through this doctrinal needle that the revival centers had created.
There's a term that you may have heard. It's called deconstruction. It's not the sort of Jacques Derrida style deconstruction. It's this idea that you, as a Christian, can deconstruct your beliefs, and which you're totally not allowed to do in the revival center. But it's a big deal in this evangelical scene that we kind of dabble in. But it sounds to me like after you left the church, you certainly deconstructed, in the lead up to leaving the revival centers. But then afterwards, you hung around churches for a little while. The last time you're at church, I guess, you said, I walked out of the church knowing I wasn't a Christian. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that was a surprise to me. So when I had that realization in Barcelona, I don't need to be in the revival center to be a good person. But the sort of part B of that was, I still want to be a Christian, a follower of Christ. I just need to find the right church. I still hadn't worked out that this all hinged around the problems with the RCI doctrine position on speaking in tongues. That hadn't quite formed. So it started there, into conflict with the revival center pastors, leave, know that it's not right, but not exactly sure why. And then once I went to this strange evangelical church in Costa Rica when I was on holidays, and then I went to another one in south of London. Then I went to C3, Oxford Falls, Sydney, and kind of let myself go with the flow, being told that the raising of the hands and the falling over, that this was all just emotional nonsense. So I had this like voice in my head going, this is ridiculous, this is phony. But I was like, shut up, voice in my head, Pastor Ian. And part of me thought he might walk in and catch me raising my hands that first time. But I went with the flow, and it felt good. Got to say, it felt really good. But then I ran into some other questions that were really my own questions, not the sort of cynicism of the revival centers. The money thing made me very uncomfortable. And there were two other things. One was that it just seemed all about the cell and not the content of the gospel. And the third thing was that it didn't seem to be at all interested in the community around it. And I was really interested to hear you guys hit on that point in that earlier podcast when you talked about leaving the AOG. They were big things for me. To me, that just had to be part of it, had to be part of a good church. So then I went to a smaller, more lo-fi Pentecostal church, Christian Life Centre in Mona Vale. And that's where I met a guy for the first time who broke down the doctrine for me. And by then I'd worked out what I was actually out there looking for. I was out there looking to understand the Revival Centre's salvation message and what was right or wrong with it and where everyone else stood with it. See, at this point, I didn't know what other churches believed you needed to do to be saved. All I knew was they had it wrong. I just sat there, and the first question, I finally boiled it down. I said, do you have to speak in tongues to be saved? And he's like, no. And so, yeah, I unpacked that in the book. And that was the moment that recast the whole New Testament for me. And so quickly, the Revival Centre theory fell apart in seconds. He said, show me the verse where it says you have to speak in tongues to be saved. And I thought, well, I've heard this my whole life. It must be right here. It's in Acts 2. I couldn't find it. Ridiculous. Anyway, I ended up with some similar concerns about that church, mostly that it was very inward looking. And also there was, even though I didn't have to speak in tongues to be saved, there was still so much speaking in tongues and these spiritual experiences, kind of Toronto style, that it made me feel like unless I had it, I didn't have the full package. And again, I felt inadequate. And then finally, this Anglican church, St. Matthew's in Manly, I felt like they had it right. They balanced all these things. There wasn't all the sort of experiential stuff that made me feel like I wasn't being given, God's full range of gifts. They were really community orientated, and they had a very simple take on the doctrine, which was just backed up everywhere in Scripture. Believe in me and you will be saved. I'm like, that's what a Christian is. It's not all this other stuff. That's what a Christian is. They believe in Jesus and they follow him. And this woman got up, and she was the wife of the pastor, this youth pastor, and she just really sold it. And she gave a great rendition of what the gospel was along those lines I just mentioned. And she talked about how much she loved Jesus. And there was so much clarity in that moment and in what she was saying that it clarified something for me. It's like, I don't feel the same way. I don't love Jesus in that way. And actually, then that's when the dominoes started to fall. It's like, well, do I believe the story of him being the Son of God and then crucified? It's like, not really. That God created the world and created sin that we would one day have to repent from. And I just knew. I'd never really believed it. And that's when I realized, and it wasn't what I expected. I expected I would still be a Christian, and I was just finding the right church. But it all just, once I simplified it, the bottom just fell out of the whole thing.
And I think that's an all too common story, Tom, that a lot of people, they start deconstructing like you're doing. You pull one piece out and go, okay, the rest can survive. Then you pull the next piece out. This is what I did. I went, literal resurrection? Yeah. What? As if. Son of God? Nah. Good bloke? Yeah, he's a good bloke. And all of a sudden, you're left with nothing. So, and you've some people are able to put that back together into some semblance of something that they can really hang on to and go, yeah, I'm still a Christian, but I'm super progressive.
Mm,
So it's interesting.
I can understand that position. Like sometimes the ideas of Jesus, forgiveness, unconditional love, um, everyone being equal in the sight of God. Like these are pretty revolutionary in some ways, and they're a nice counterpoint to some of the annoying parts. Like even hardcore progressives could do with some of those lessons, And actually, sometimes find myself thinking those ideas are really good. And then I can see how someone might define themselves as a Christian in that way. I can understand that logic.
I reckon we need to put you in touch with a couple of the progressive listeners in our audience. I reckon they're going, "Oh, there's still hope for him. There's still hope for him." The thing that I always find attractive still to this day, I mean, both Brian and I are not Christians anymore, but the thing that I still find attractive was Jesus' standing up to authority and standing up to imperialism. He stood up to the Romans as much as he stood up to
Mm,
the religious people, and that's cool. But
mm,
the Buddha did some amazing things.
mm.
Muhammad did some amazing things. And even, dare I say it, the Mormons, Joseph Smith is said to have done some amazing things. But is it true? Or is it just mythologized,
Mm.
archetypes?
Yep. Yeah, I think it's the latter, and I mean, isn't it a great position just to be able to take the good from it and like see the positives in those values?
I agree, and I mean, even we're this is the third season of the podcast, and I think we're in a very different place than we were when we even started. So it's been a journey for us as we discuss and define who we are and redefine. And I think that sort of stuff just continues with the more knowledge you get, the more exposure, and also giving less of a shit in the end where people sit. I mean, I think we said this in a recent episode. Just don't be an asshole. That's a great thing. I don't care what you believe. Just don't be an asshole.
And can I also say, I think it's made us more tolerant. Believe it or not, here we
Mm,
are making a podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist and throwing tomatoes and rotten fruit at, Pentecostalism in the stocks. And yet I feel we've become much more tolerant. We've got in the audience and even people that have become our friends that are still Christians. And they're great
yeah,
people.
yeah,
You've got to cross that chasm, I think.
yeah. So, look, an example for me. So I'm there at Triple J, which is sort of seen as fairly left wing, hosting the National Current Affairs program during the same sex marriage plebiscite. And a lot of people I knew in the media were arguing that we shouldn't give no campaigners a voice because we were platforming homophobia. And sure, some people, the way they went about their arguments weren't respectful. And fair enough, that means you shouldn't be part of a debate if you can't be respectful. But it went too far in a lot of cases where people's beliefs weren't respected. They were branded with this logo that meant they were person non grata in a modern society. So I found myself kind of pulling in the other direction a little bit because the so-called tolerance movement had become very intolerant at certain points. And they had logic and reason to back that up, but I feel like in some cases it went too far and they had become intolerant.
Yeah, look, it's interesting, isn't it? And I mean, if you look now at cancel culture, it's rife. And, there's many points of view on cancel culture. For me, it sits uncomfortably because we're not allowing voice. And I know it's got to be measured. And as you say, you can't give a platform to hate. However, I think we have to, you
Yeah,
don't
but let,
always.
let me just stop you there. Like even that gets challenging. Oh, you can't platform hate. Well, who decides what hate is or hate speech? Like, and then anyone branded with that suddenly isn't allowed in the media. I also feel really uncomfortable with and some of these labels that get used, which are only mean certain things to certain communities, remind me of the church lingo.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how we still are shaped by that. Like if I look through COVID the COVID lens recently. You know, the anti-vax movement was a very strong movement. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, all bouncing around. And for me, I didn't question as much as I would with some of the stuff bouncing around because I thought, I've seen these fucking conspiracies before. I'm not going to actually give any airtime to these conspiracies because that's the shit that drove me in deeper and deeper into this Pentecostalism, into this exclusivity. So when I saw a lot of this stuff, and it was coming out of fundamentalism as well, a lot of the COVID conspiracies, I probably questioned it less than I would because I was so turned off by where it was coming from. So it's a really difficult one to work out because here I am, many, many years later, still influenced in some sort of way, even if it's a different bent, but I'm still influenced by that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of similar patterns. The way people join the dots on different narratives, and when that combines with sort of groupthink and echo chambers and different communities, those messages can be kind of powerful and confusing.
Yeah, well, a lot of it traces back to the Satanic Panic, from the 70s and 80s, and so that has evolved into what's the
QAnon.
yeah, into QAnon. I mean, that all comes from Satanic Panic, which, if you can believe that there's satanic ritual abuse happening in the 70s, then you can believe that it's still happening, and now Hillary Clinton's running it. Look, I want to ask you another question because we're almost out of time, and that is that when I read your book and also watched a few interviews with you, I don't hear the word cult when you talk about the revival centers. Is that intentional, or do you just don't think they're a cult?
It is intentional. So, in some of that general research I did, I spoke to a few sociologists about sort of what those labels mean and when they use them. And basically, I think you can call it a cult, and it has many aspects of a cult, but I felt sect was just slightly more specifically accurate to the revival centers because what really defined it was that doctrinal position. And so I think that sits more closely with the definition of a sect, which is about, its religious position rather than just necessarily the culture of the organization. So the culture of the organization was cultish and had many of the hallmarks, but if I'm going to use one, I call it a sect. And the other slight issue I had with the word cult is that it's just used across so many different aspects of society that I feel like the meaning of it has been bled out a little bit, and it isn't super well defined. So, and look, yeah, and I guess I feel like that might be unfair. So that was my thinking, and I totally accept that in many ways it is a cult, and it would be totally fine to call it that. That's just the choice I made.
Yeah, well, it's a loaded term. I get that, and I mean, Brian and I have talked about this on the podcast a lot. That if everything's a cult, then nothing's a cult, and you
Mm,
know, and it just really comes down to how you define it. So whether you want to say sect, whether you want to say cult, whether you want to say high control group,
mm,
whatever, doesn't phase us. But we did come to the realization at the end of last season that we felt we're happy to now. I mean, I've called the Revival Center a cult since the
mm.
80s, but I think we actually were happy to take that label and apply it to the AOG and to mainstream Pentecostalism. But I guess it's the way we define it. I mean, when we say cult, what do you hear? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of think about Waco and like these really extreme kind of groups where there's a lot of violence and all these other probably more even extreme rituals. That's part of what I think, and I also think it often infers like a live in kind of scenario as well, which the revival centers obviously isn't. So yeah, I mean, you guys are way deeper on this. It's not a label I would use on the AOG or Hillsong, but I do accept that it has many of the characteristics of a cult.
Yeah, and I guess like you're right. You don't live in. However, they create a world that you have to live in.
Oh
So
yeah,
you know,
psychologically.
Absolutely, and but also, physically in some sort of ways, the only time that you're really out of the bubble is when you go to work, and the rest of the
Mm,
time you've got Bible study or home groups during the week. You've got youth group on a Saturday night. You've got some sort of social activity on a Friday night. Then you've got Sunday services times two, and the in between
yeah.
lunch, and very similar to Revival Centre in that way. So you certainly are given these parameters to live within, to breathe within, to act within, and it becomes your world. So
Mm.
I guess that's where we got to, as we went. You know what? We were actually boxed into this space, this virtual space that became our real space, and so it was quite controlling.
The definitions are interesting, are they? I was in an interview the other day with Mark Boris, and he said, "You were programmed. You were programmed," and it didn't feel right. And
But don't you think your whole needing to undo all that doctrine, doesn't that feel like a
yeah,
deprogramming? Like you had to,
yeah,
once you finally, this prison of the mind was opened up, you went, oh, well, thanks very much. I'm on my way.
yes, you're right. And look, he was probably right. It was just again, it was a word with a whole set of baggage and definitions that I hadn't properly overlaid over my experience. So it sat uncomfortably, and it's also not something you really want to admit either. So there's a bit of maybe that's a little bit of ego sort of pushing back there. Was there anything else in the book that you thought didn't stack up or raise a lot of questions? That was a great question about the sect and the cult definition.
Well, first of all, I don't want you to walk away from this going, bastards made me say it was a cult, right? You say what you want, right?
I'm very open that yeah, um, it's just my choice. I'm not saying I've made it's the right choice. It's kind of a personal decision to define it in that way. We grew up in this environment where you couldn't challenge and question people, and I do it for a living now, respectfully. I've gone hard on the prime minister and politicians, and I'm stoked that we live in this liberal society where we can, a little boy like me can take it to the prime minister, and it means that you learn how to respectfully debate things with people and not get lost taking it personally.
All right. So, what's your relationship to the revival centers now? Have you heard from them? Has there been any backlash? Have you got letters from lawyers?
No, nothing.
Ian McGregor?
Well, a few people that still have family in there saying they're losing their minds over it, and it's sort of there's people going pretty crazy in the fishbowl. That's what someone said to me. I don't want to cause them distress, and I know I'm getting heaps of messages of people thanking me for telling their story. Like that's so beautiful and so nice. So I know that the book is making it a lot more people feel very comfortable with who they are and the bad experiences that they were forced to go through. A lot more people are getting that benefit as opposed to the cost that's coming at people who are still inside. The census says it's 700 people. That's what it's kind of come down to officially. So I don't know if anyone's going to hit me up. I'm really surprised I haven't had a stray Facebook message or something like that. But it's just been really positive. And there's three kinds of feedback that I'm getting that I really like. One is I read it in one day. Like, that's a really nice thing to hear. The second is you're telling my story. This is kind of lifting a burden off my shoulders. But the other nice bit of feedback I really like seeing is I'm a Christian and I like the way you wrote this book. You haven't taken the opportunity to slam all Christians, and you've learned along the way and nuanced your views, and that means a lot to me. And I guess that's sort of what you were touching on when you're saying you have believers that listen to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I guess we want to really celebrate your book because it was and is a fantastic book. So we do encourage people to get it, download it, buy the physical copy, whatever you're going to do, get your hands on it because it is great. But I think it's not just something that our listeners would enjoy. It's people gives it's a bit like people have described our podcast. It's a bit like a prison story. Like, not many of us go to prison. So when someone tells a story of what it's like in prison, people go, wow, that's amazing. Prison's just incredible. I didn't know those angles. And it's the same with these hardcore fundamentalist religions, that when you give somebody a view into it and what it does to you, how it shapes you, how it changes your story, and you've got to fight back against that story that it's
Mm,
changed you into. I think it's really interesting, and it's really insightful for people. So, but one thing we haven't touched on, unfortunately, as much, and I think that you said this at the start about your family.
mm,
You made this really about family and community, and you were the first one in your family, in your immediate family, to exit the revival center, and
mm,
then basically until all of your immediate family members were out of the revival center. So it's a real powerful story of how people left, but how you stayed connected. Like I
mm.
was fascinated by your mum and dad just sound like amazing humans, and how they defied the rules of the revival centers to stay connected to you even after you were out. And really, they shouldn't have had anything to do with you if you adhered strictly to the rules. So, what sort of impact did that have on them and you?
I said at my dad's 70th that we'd actually followed his example, the true, not what he'd said via the sort of um, the words and the rules and the precepts of the revival center. It was who he and my mother truly were as people, their real values that made us who we are, and those same values came into direct conflict with the dogmatic revival center, and that's why it imploded. So they just weren't hardliners. They ended up in this church, and it meant something for them at that time, at the ages of 25 and 29 respectively. Then they ended up bringing their kids in it, and this is what I had to think about. How did my parents make this decision to land their children into this terrible church? And I had to go back and think about it from their point of view, because they're good people. It's step by step. It's one increment at a time. That's how life works. You know, you don't make these top down structural decisions. You just live one experience to the next. And that's so I had to go back and just sort of think through their perspective a bit more as well. Yeah. So that was really, really interesting. And yeah, someone else asked me in another interview recently, yeah, what was different about your family? Why did you leave, and why did you stick together? And yeah, I think it was a lot about just who my parents truly were. And maybe they had enough confidence outside of that small community to know that we could still stand up, whereas some people just really, it's all they have, and so for them it's even harder to step away. um, we had educations and careers and um, strong families on both sides, like going back many generations, and going across across the family tree as well, so that helped us.
Do you sort of claim the crown for the one of leading the family out of revival centers? Because you were the brave one. You were the one to take the first step.
Yeah, it's a funny one. Like, I never wanted to kind of gloat about it or rub it in their faces, because it was kind of, I don't know, it was a bit shameful, like, and I was just so glad that they left. That was the main thing. I've never, yeah, I never wanted to make them feel bad about it.
No, just
Yeah,
write a book, Tom.
just put it out to the whole nation and
Did you ever ask them about it? Did you ever say to them, or did you have to? Did they say sorry? Did you ask them to say sorry for raising you in a sect?
no, no, they didn't say sorry. It was more, I know that they are on some levels, but they know that it wasn't that simple, and that I have compassion for that. And but they did, what they did say was, sorry you had to go through that alone, the leaving. That's and sorry we didn't. Yeah, and this is where it cuts a bit deeper. Sorry that we didn't understand what that was like, and sorry that we didn't know how much you were hurting during those times, and that we weren't there for you during those couple of years of the transition period. But it wasn't a sorry we got into the whole thing, because they don't want to see their lives in that way. And I totally understand that. Like, these were also amazing years, as you guys have experienced. You can't throw your whole life away as like framed around the mistakes. It's not a nice way to live, and it's not a nice way to. Nice is not even the right word, but it's not a loving, truthful way to engage with your life in this context anyway.
No, I completely agree. I mean, there's too much good stuff to throw it away. I mean, for me, it's, I look back on it and I look back at a fair amount of it fondly, but also the skills that it imparted. I think it's made me a better person. I wish I hadn't have had to go through or gone through what I went through being a part of that. But God, I can see the advantages of it.
You know, the other defining thing, I think, which would determine how you land on this kind of question we're discussing is, are you happy now? So I think probably with what you're saying there, Brian, that you look back on it fondly, it sounds like you like your life now. Whereas if you were if you were really disappointed with your life, if you were really up against it, or you weren't sitting in a nice home with lovely curtains and a, don't know what that artwork is, but if if you weren't happy with where your life had landed, I don't think you would see it in the same way if you were really hurting and struggling now, decades later. But I think it's almost a privilege and a luxury to be happy where you are now and to be able to look through it and pick the good from the bad.
I think it's a choice, though. Like it's most certainly a choice. I mean, we've come across many, many angry people who
Mm,
are still incredibly angry about 20, 30 years ago. They're angry about being born into this space. They're angry about coming into the space and feeling like they're ripped off. Much like you when you wrote the book, you probably wouldn't have thought how many people could connect with it. I mean, we've got a community here from people from many countries. We've got listeners across the world,
mm,
who are connecting with this, and people joining our online communities and telling their story. There is quite an amount of people in there that are still really angry and really hurting, and probably haven't got to that point where they've been able to make that choice quite
mm,
yet about accepting it, processing it, and working it out.
Yeah, and I think Brian, it can be a stage. Like people
mm,
can go through this and be angry for a time, but as we've said before, you can't stay there. Because if you stay in that angry space, then you're just letting the bastards win, and you
yeah.
just can't. And so that's why I think, Tom, it's really important that someone with your platform has told this story. It's an audience. You've got an audience that goes beyond the people that have been there. It's the friends that
Mm,
have people that have been there. It's the family of people that have been
mm,
there. I was watching television the other night, and my wife and I were watching the ABC, and the ad for your book came up,
mm,
and I just
mm.
thought, "Fuck, man! So many people are going to hear our story." And that's really what I thought in that moment, because as you've heard so many people tell you, you're telling our story. And so many people are listening to this. I mean, thousands is what is downloading this podcast now. And they're going to just read your book and go, that's my story. And it's just really important what you've done. And I don't know if that's what you were thinking when you wrote the book, but that's the impact that you're having.
Yeah, and it wasn't. It wasn't what I was thinking. I thought it would give hope to people who've been through something similar. But this phrase that you're saying, like you're telling my story or our story, it's it's I don't even know what it means almost. Do you know what I mean? It's so powerful, that phrase. It's doing something to people that I didn't realize it would. And I've been in storytelling forever. There's something about having your experience made public in this way, isn't there? I'm still it's still unfolding for me, this reaction.
Yeah, it's hugely powerful. And you know what it means, Tom? It means you can become a leader of a movement and just request 5% and undercut your competitors.
10%? ten
No, no,
percent
no. No, no.
tithes?
Undercut. Undercut, Tom. This is the key to business. You come in low, get them hooked in, and then bump it up to maybe seven and a
I still
half.
like that stay home Sundays, save 10%. I reckon that's the best line.
Yeah, no, a friend said, "Well, what's the second book gonna be about?" I was like, "Well, that's about starting your own cult, surely. It's the obvious sequel."
Or it could be the other use of tongues, the wild years.
Uh,
Yeah, no, this thing about it's unlock for yeah, I think it's maybe partly that it's someone telling the story who has a bit of a platform to share it more widely, but partly that I don't know, it maybe it doesn't get unpacked in this kind of detail, the inner journey of it. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
I think one thing that I connected with, I know Troy did, and our listeners who will read this book will, is your honesty. Like it's something that's a rarity when people write. Like you were
But is it? What does
incredibly.
that mean? What do you mean by that?
The honesty of when you said, I've got to say, man, I'm sorry, this, I don't mean to belittle this, all right? But I thought, fuck, this is so fucking honest. When you're talking about, ejaculating between the
Hot dogging, yeah. Had to land that phrase in the book.
Yeah, no, well done. And for those listeners, look in the show notes for a link to that video. We no, but I mean, it's. I've completely lost my track of thought now. No, but no, it's the vulnerability. Like you made yourself incredibly vulnerable when you told your story. You may not think that because maybe it's just you, and maybe you're owning who you were. But a lot of people won't write with that level of vulnerability, which allows people to connect to you and to your story.
Yeah, I don't. It's funny. I don't feel that vulnerable about it. It's weird. Maybe I'm a psychopath.
wouldn't be the first Pentecostal psychopath, dude. Wouldn't be the first one.
No, like I was in tears so many times in the book. I can't be a psychopath, but psychopath would say that. No, I don't know. Like I thought the narrative about the awkwardness around sexuality, like I think that was really important. I think that's a very important internal journey that the young people that go through this stuff have. And so, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a story where there was abuse. And this is the funny thing about my book. That's like, it's not extreme in those really fringe ways, but actually it is really extreme in a
Yeah, it's
psychological
totally
way.
extreme, Tom. That's the thing, like it's your story. So in one sense, it's normal to you, but to people on the outside, this isn't normal, dude. What you went through is not normal, and it is extreme. Being unable to make decisions for yourself really until you could walk away, that's not normal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. I guess it's just all just couched in this reality that I'm not feeling broken because of it. Do you know what I mean? Like it didn't break me. I won. I walked out with my head held high, and I'm proud of the way I handled myself in the worst of those moments. And so I'm not ashamed of it, and I'm not broken and angry now. And I'm getting the sense, and maybe you guys can tell me this from an outsider's perspective, but the sort of gentle fairness that I've tried to strike with this book, and not slam dunking anyone, that feels like that's working for people as well. That allows them to connect with it without, I don't know, feeling any hatred or anything that sort of distances you from the emotional connection. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it is the right thing to do, and I think it allows people to come in like it, and it's gentle. Like you haven't alienated anybody by coming out angry and swinging, and I think that's a great thing, and it's a gracious thing because you probably would have ammunition to make it more of an angry rant of a book, but you haven't done that, and I think that's the beautiful thing about it, is it invites people in to experience what you experience through your storytelling.
And that's what we try to do with the podcast too, because once upon a time this was us. We were these people, and remember, Brian, people got really upset when Brian Houston had all this scandal quite recently. We made this comment at the start saying, is the woman okay? Let's make this first. Is the woman okay? Are the people that are accusing him, these women that were harassed, are they okay? We made that clear first. And then we said, but also put down your stones from your glass house. This man has a family, etc., etc. And we weren't for a minute excusing his behavior.
Yeah.
But so many people turned on us in that moment, saying, you're dismissing what he did and all this. And it's like, but we started the whole sentence with, are these women okay?
No.
And we tried
Some
to come
people
from
can't
that
hear
place.
it, can they? They can't hear compassion for the more powerful person. And this is a problem with hardcore progressive politics when it goes too far. If someone's higher up on the power hierarchy, no compassion for them. And this is where it gets messed up. And this is where actually going to sound like a Christian, but like that's where, I mean, Jesus set that off in a way. He attacked the powerful, the rich, and the scribes and the Pharisees as well. So in some ways, he was a bit like that, but in other ways, he told us to have compassion for everybody. So, and I think, yeah, I find that a bit distasteful about sort of some of the current political climate. Yeah, I think my battery's about to die
That's
on my computer.
cool. And that's a sign. That's a sign from God, Tom.
I'm really interested in this stuff though, like where this is going. Like I feel like I'm on the start of a new journey by putting this out there, and connecting with new people feels like I don't know where it's going, but it's interesting.
Well, we are absolutely here to connect with and can connect you to others and help, as we all go on this journey together, because I think that it is a continuation of our journeys from fundamentalism out the other side, and there's lots of stuff on the horizon. There's no doubt about that. So we are happy to collaborate, Tom.
Yeah. We'll listen to your radio show. We'll listen to your podcast, and you listen to ours.
Yeah,
That would be
that's a
good.
deal.
It can just be that if you want. That's cool.
Yeah, well, look, I think flogging this book as hard as possible is a good starting point as well.
I think so. And look, we don't just say this because we actually don't have people on the podcast that we don't want to promote, that we don't want to chat about the stuff and celebrate what they do. So we certainly don't say it lightly. Get the book, people. It's great. It really is an awesome read. You will connect. It is your story. For the vast majority of people who were in this same space, it's your story. So you will connect and you'll want to tell others about it. You'll witness about the book.
So thanks very much, Tom. Thanks very much for being a part of this.
We'll see you later.